Okay, so joining me today, Michael Baker from Wayfarer, who you all know. NDIS is obviously a very popular thing out there in the market, and Shartru approved this one for wholesale investors. And there's a particular reason why we've approved this one as opposed to some of the others that are thrown up. So, Bakes, just to kick us off, mate, can you talk us through a few of the traps with some of these NDIS offerings that are getting around at the moment?
Sure. I guess just to set the scene, most people would know me from the Wayfarer business, where I sort of obviously distribute some fund managers out there. This one is quite different in that I'm actually embedded into this business, and this sort of goes back 3 years when I started to distribute, I guess, a competitive fund manager in the space. And that was my first interaction, and where I got to understand some of the key components of how this SDA housing sector works. And I've spent that 3 years sort of filtering through the market to find who I think are the best counterparties in the space. And there's a few key components there that are critical in this space. And I think some of the other sort of options out there in the market don't really address these issues, I think, to their detriment, and obviously to the detriment of investors. So I'll tick off a couple of those things quickly and highlight why I think they're important. So when I put Uplift Living together with Jonathan and a few other people involved, the one thing I identified that the key component to this whole industry is the SDA provider. And what the SDA provider does is act as the conduit between the government and the tenant and their placement into assets around the country. So they're the key component to making sure that the tenants are in appropriate accommodation, but also in accommodation in a locale that they want. So a lot of the work that SDA provider does in the background is heat mapping of requirements for postcodes on how much demand there is for certain styles of accommodation in those postcodes. So a lot of the press that we've seen has been around a lot of development in southeast Queensland. The key component to that is that the Queensland government was the first to move on concessions for the space. So GST, land tax, and things like that. So that encouraged development within that space. So we have seen some not overdevelopment, but a lot of development in that space just because it was an easier process to do. What the SDA
and just on that, I think probably we all know, or we're aware that the NDIS has got some benefits that are given to it by the government, right, which makes it attractive.
Yeah.
But the flip side of that is when the government gets involved and they start throwing money around, all and sundry come out. So that it can be, whilst it's the benefit, it can also be a very big risk.
Correct. And there's two parts to it. All the press that we're seeing at the moment, there was a story on Four Corners the other night. This is all around the care component of the NDIS. So split it in two. One part is the care providers, so the carers of each individual, and the other part is the accommodation. So we're purely focused on the accommodation and the provision of appropriate accommodation to the different categories. So we're focused on high physical support, which is the highest level of accommodation within the market. But most of the press you're seeing around, Bill Shorten announcing that they're doing investigations into rorting into the system, that's all around the care side. They're actually lifting year on year the provisions for the property side because there's still just nowhere near enough accommodation out there for users. So laying that to bed straight away, everything you're reading in the press is not about the provision of assets, it's about the provision of care. We've picked a group called NDISP as our SDA partner. Now, there's a few reasons for that. One is they're the largest private SDA provider in the country. So from a scale perspective, they have the right amount of clients for us not to have to worry about viability. That doesn't get discussed. There's a lot of SDA providers in the country who are loss-making exercises and actually probably won't be around in 12 months. We don't have to worry about that given their scale. Secondly, they provide all the architecture and guidance on construction. I'm not going off looking for an architect to build these things. The architecture is provided by the SDA provider as part of our agreement package. And thirdly, I've been able to bring John Johnson, who's the founder of NDISP, onto my board and onto my investment committee. So we can't go off and just buy pieces of land at will. We have to go through a 3-stage process, which is using the heat mapping that they provide to show highest levels of demand. We then have to go back once we've found lands to work out if it's close enough to amenities within the scheme of what they require for each type of accommodation. And then the third component is they'll actually send an inspector to the site to do a review of topography, how close it is to amenities, what the footpaths are like, so right down to the minutiae. So as a fund manager, we can't just use the money and spend it at will. We have to go through this process to go and acquire land and then put their specific asset onto that site. So there's 3 levels of control all the way along. Once we buy that piece of land, we then sign a contract with NDISP. That then locks that asset into their client pipeline. So they'll start to then work on a marketing program to put tenants in, so that by the time we hand the keys over to them, they have the tenants lined up to move straight in. And then when those tenants move in and we hand the keys over, we then sign a 20-year head lease with NDISP. From that moment on, they're in complete control of the asset. They're in complete control of the tenants within that asset. We sit back as a passive and only act if there's a requirement to do something at the site. So compare that to other exercises out there. They're not going through that step. They're building the asset first. They're doing the if you build it, they will come kind of process. It's completely the wrong way about. You have to have the SDA provider first, tenant second, and then the asset. So the asset's the last part of the puzzle, not the first part.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Now, what about the building? Who do you partner with on the building side of things?
So we will always partner with a social housing construction expert. So to date, we've built 8 assets in Queensland and Northern New South Wales with a group called Bryant. And the reason we've partnered with Bryant there is that they're a social housing expert. But because they do social housing, and actually that includes schools and other government facilities, they're actually audited quarterly by the state government in Queensland, which means obviously from an investor's point of view, it's another layer of risk removal where the government does audits and make sure that they're financially viable. And then for us to break ground with Bryant's, we actually have to show the money for the project up front in a trust account. And that, again, removes that sort of view that developers are just rolling some profit from one development into the next, leveraging up and then getting the next development going. They won't break ground unless I can show the completed monies for that project up front. So it's a 2-way street on risk control, but for investors, it's a double layer of protection during that development phase.
Yep, excellent. The other, I think, interesting thing about how you've structured this is how you actually raise the money, in regards to you're raising the money as you need it, as you go, as opposed to, I know there's some people out there that are raising a whole ton of cash and then they're having to go spend it.
Yeah.
You might just talk to us a bit about how you put that together.
Sure. So again, it comes back to the guidance from NDISP as the SDA provider. So in discussions with them on building this product, what I didn't want to do, which is happening out there, is raise a vast amount of money and then be forced to try and house that money, because otherwise there's cash drag on your investment. So we sat down with them and they very quickly showed us a pipeline of immediate opportunity out there. And in some respects, we've put our foot on 3 pieces of land around the country already. But what I'm doing is I'm spending the money on identified portfolio. I'm not raising money and then having to find a home for it. And again, it comes back to this process with NDISP, because I have to go through their approval to purchase land. If I raise too much money, it would take us years to try and go through that process to allocate the money out to acquisition. So all we're doing is raising enough for what we can see as an immediate pipeline. We'll build that pipeline and then I'll come back to market at another time and we'll do it again with another identified pipeline, rather than just raise as much money as possible and then try and find a home for it.
Yeah. No, from an investor's perspective, I think that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so is there anything else that, just to finish off, that you think is important for people to understand?
Yeah, look, I think this is becoming a highly topical sector, and because there's obviously government backing to the funding in this space, there's going to be a lot of people looking to get involved. I just sort of I praise caution with this space, because there's a lot of difference in the offerings out there at the moment. And what we're trying to do is actually educate as part of this process. So some of the offerings that you will see will only offer you an income stream, as an example. They won't offer you any equity in the assets themselves. So they retain all of the uplift in the assets. If they're building them, they keep all of the development profit in that. So what we're trying to do with our structure is every investor owns the asset from the time we purchase the land. That means they get the uplift in the development of that asset, and then they own the asset from the point of that time of opening the doors right through to the point of sale, and the uplift in the value over that period of time, as well as the income stream that comes for it. They get both sides of the equation plus the development profit. We're not taking a skim off that. It sits and flows straight back through the unit trust structure, and each of the investors share in that all the way along the investment process.
Yeah, makes sense. That's for sure.
Yeah, and then the only other, obviously the obvious question will come up is why are we doing a wholesale offering?
Yeah.
And again, at this point of the life cycle of this space, we just think it's important that it's kept as a wholesale offering. Partly because we think that there's some working out that needs to be done within the space. But secondly, when we're working with counterparties in this space, we can get preferential terms by staying as a wholesale investor, and that passes through as a benefit to the investors. So we get better terms on our debt, on the assets. We get better terms with our insurance and other things, where they don't have the worry of retail at this stage, because effectively, whether it's a big four bank or a PI provider or a big global insurer, they all look at this space as new, and they don't really have a full feel yet for how it works. So if you can find ways to allay their fears, and one of those is very clearly keeping it a wholesale offering, we'll get better terms on all our counterparty contracts. And so at this stage, while it's new, we'll stick to wholesale. As the world gets more familiar with both the space but also how we operate, then we can look to convert it to retail, but we'll stick to wholesale at this stage.
Well, let's hope that you have a look at the retail space in the near future, because whilst I think it's a great opportunity, obviously, that's available to wholesale. We'd like to see that to retail guys down in the future as well. So
we would also.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
All right, Bakes, mate. Thanks heaps for joining us, and yeah, we'll best of luck with the fund. I think it's a ripper, and yeah, we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Rob.
Thanks, mate.
Cheers.